where I stole it. This is the proposal of Ed Merrill, and the person that is under Ed Merrill is Pat Wong. We will come back to Pat Wong in a minute. Pat retired last year as vice president of ALSA, 2 years ago when ALSA was closing. And this was the proposal to NIH with which they were going to support the new biomaterials, especially heparinized biomaterials. If you go down here, you will see polyvinyl alcohol. Those of you who know about Mike's early work, you will remember that Cynthia Cholakis did her PhD on heparinized PVA, I think. PVA definitely. And if you go back, you will see other materials, pyrolytic carbon, silicons, and so on. What is unusual, for those of you who know how we write proposals now, is this proposal was written in 1970, almost 40 years ago, and it was 6 pages, 5 pages. And it doesn't have, Molly, please notice, it doesn't have any description of any experiment to be done. It just says, we will do this. In view of the extensive literature, we will work also with silicons. And they got the money, and that's the money that supported Mike and me and several others in the laboratory in that particular period. This is the way we were. This is the best picture I have of Mike and me and everybody else in Merrill's laboratory in May 1972. Maybe you've shown it already, Mike, in other occasions. This is Steve Rose, and here we have Hossein Benjamali, who graduated and stayed. He came to Canada. He was originally from Iran. He came to Canada, and he's a big man in oil industry or something like that. Tim Burke, Mike with his hair always, and myself in the laboratory. The laboratory was well equipped for that period of time. These were the hoods we had and so on. And another thing that you don't perhaps know is that Mike had an undergraduate assistant in the laboratory helping him in 1972, and that is David Turrell, who is now the chair of chemical engineering and chemistry at Caltech. And this is a description of the thesis, styrene butadiene black copolymers by Mike Sefton. And if you start looking at it, you will see really how we were working in those very early days of biomaterials. Basically, the first thing that is said here is to prepare the styrene butadiene black copolymer and to characterize it, the mechanical behavior, experimental studies, and you come down here. And finally, over here comes this idea of coupling heparin on SBS black copolymer. But for those of you who know polymers, you cannot do that unless you hydroxylate it, or at least you react on the surface something. And that's really what Mike was doing. And this became a very, very detailed analysis of molecular structure of polymers, because when you hydroxylate, the surface becomes swellable. You have a swelling process. There is a front moving in. Believe it or not, in 1972, he was working on things that I work on now, on the anomalous diffusion in glassy polymers and in rubbery polymers. And in fact, his first paper in 1975 was exactly on that, really looking at the front as it was coming into the material. But this became really the heart of the work, and don't forget, he came to MIT to work on biomedical problems. At the same time, I was doing the polyvinyl alcohol, and again, the crystallization, the preparation by gamma irradiation. We used also electron beam irradiation. And finally here, guess what? The hematological studies of the crystalline polyvinyl alcohol. This is important because when Mike became independent in 1974 and came here to the University of Houston to start his work, this was one of the first projects he took. And really, he developed it, I think, for about 6, 7, 8 years. He was working on heparinized materials. And I remember several of his very early students working on those systems. Why heparinization of hydrogels and other biomaterials? At that time, this was really an extremely important subject, to try to come up with new biomaterials that could last over a long period of time without clotting on the surface. And we felt that really, if we could react heparin on the surface, we were going to be able to do that. This is a transparency from 1971, which I have kept, and I scan it on purpose for you to see. At that time, and I'm talking to students that were not even born at that time, at that time, we didn't have the systems we have now to draw those things. All these things were drawn by draftsmen, or very often by us, using stencils, using rapidographs, using things that you don't even know they exist anymore, with ink and so on, and creating the simple structures. And this is one that shows the problem with heparinization and how, unfortunately, native blood, yes, comes on the surface and it is repelled and you have native blood, but sometimes you have, unfortunately, an exchange with the surface and then you don't have heparinization anymore. This was a classic paper that appeared in 1968 in the American Society of Artificial Internal Organs, the Transactions of the American Society of Artificial Internal Organs. It was by Lagenger and Eriksson from Sweden. And basically, they were the first ones who were doing ionic interaction on the surface, and they were heparinizing the surfaces. It was working magnificently. Unfortunately, there was protein exchange on the surface. So really, you had a certain biocompatibility or chemocompatibility for a little while, but then you were having a material that was useless. How was biomaterials education in those early days? Was it an elusive dream? At MIT, at least, there was not HST or anything like this. We were taking medical courses and graduate courses, and I want to show you this. It's really fascinating. I don't know if Mike remembers it. We had a newsletter, chemical engineering newsletter. It was called The Pipeline. And I have kept everything. I like to keep everything. So, you know, here it is from March 1972. And Merrill is making some really incredible comments here about the intellectual interest that appears in the medical field. And especially he makes some comments here that the problems are natural for engineers. He does talk about chemical engineers, but the same thing could be said of mechanical engineers. Basically, the ability to really analyze the fraud behavior and so on. What most of you don't know, Ed Merrill, before he got into biomaterials, he was working with blood rheology. So he was really a rheologist, and he was working with blood in the 60s. A very interesting part of the letter here talks about the fact that I think that everybody has pushed the mathematics and the modeling to the extreme, and even he himself wonders sometimes why he did that. This is very interesting because in graduate school, Mike was always the mathematician, and I was the experimentalist. And I don't know how it happened after that. When we became professors 10 years later, it changed. He was really incredible in mathematics. He was the best graduate student in the department. Qualifying examinations in January of 1972, 12 of us took them, 3 passed. I was the MIT, and he was number 1, of course, by far, ahead of everybody else. And he had an uncanny ability to look at the mathematical problems, especially differential equations, especially with moving boundary value problems, and solve them like this, analytically, not numerically, not with MATLAB or anything like that. It is interesting that there is another thing that is mentioned here, and I present it because I know many of you are now biomedical engineers. I also note at the present time a nationwide trend towards creation of a new professional class of biomedical engineers out of all engineering disciplines. And again, he expresses his feelings, which were the feelings of the profession at that time, that was a little bit, as the French would say, tiré par les cheveux. And the interesting thing, however, he is questioning here something that I could apply today. Who is going to pay for these biomedical engineers? He says, if they're chemical engineers, it's a producing corporation that will pay for them. But who pays for the biomedical engineer? The patient? He doubts that. And he comes to the conclusion that there has to be a radical change in the field. I don't know how Canada is, but I can tell you I'm chairing now the biomedical engineering department at Texas. And we have 120 seniors. And half of them go to medical school. And only about 30 of them find jobs as biomedical engineers after the BS degree. So some of the things he says there 40 years ago, I think are very appropriate today. Another thing that is really fascinating in these comments is, says here, in the 60s there was a lot of money for research, but in the early 70s there's not as much. In the early 70s, the pay line for NIH was 40%. 40% of the proposals submitted at that time were funded, and now it's more like 8%. So I can imagine how it was in the 60s. In the 60s, basically, 90% would be funded. And what else in teaching? I don't know if you can see this. I mean, this is how we were learning. I mean, there were not really biomaterials book. I remember the book of Steve Brook appeared in, 1972, and it was a terrible book, You were going back to the original literature, and if you look at the literature very carefully, most of the literature were biomaterials and not really very much biology. For those of you who have never seen it, this is one of the very early meetings of the Society for Biomaterials. At that time, it was called the International Biomaterials Symposium in Clemson in 1975. And here's the second annual meeting of the Society for Biomaterials in April of '76 in Philadelphia. I remember at that time I was a postdoc with Clark Colton. I had returned, and Mike was already a professor at Toronto. And I went to that meeting, and it was mostly ceramic materials at that time. A few pictures from those days. This is Mike in a picture that I like very much. That's probably from the early 80s or middle 80s. It doesn't look like Ari, the same period. Always a lot of facial hair. For those of you who don't know this man, for me, it's an idol. I mean, it is a role model, not only for the Canadians, for Americans as well. And I'd like to tell you a little bit of some of his awards that were not mentioned. So he finished his SCD, Doctor of Science, in 1974. By the way, Doctor of Science, I remember how we were getting it at MIT. A few weeks before graduation, they would ask you, do you want to get a PhD or an SCD? Fill out the form. And of course, I don't know how Mike selected, but I said, oh, in Europe, DSc is much more important than a PhD. I was planning to return to Greece. And of course, I would get an SCD. I don't know how Mike decided to do that. But let me tell you about some of his awards. In 1988, he got the Albright and Wilson Americans Award. That's from the Canadian Society of Chemical Engineers. For those of you who have come to the United States and you know what the Alan P. Colburn Award is, it's the same thing as the Alan P. Colburn Award. So it's really the most important chemical engineer of the young generation. In 1993, he got the Clemson Award, which is a very important award from the Society of Biomaterials of the United States, of which, of course, he became the president about 20 years later. This is the next one, which I don't think anybody has made. So in 1998, I think the Canadian Society of Chemical Engineers celebrated its 100th anniversary, and at that time they decided to select the 20, I think, most important chemical engineers of the century, and Michael was one of them. Okay, which is, think about it, these are chemical engineers now, saying that somebody who works on biomaterials is really one of the most important chemical engineers of the 20th century in Canada. He became a university professor in 2003. You know that he became a fellow of the Royal Society in 2005. He got the Founders Award of the US Society for Biomaterials in 2008. And of course, the Killam Prize the same year from the Canada Council of the Arts. Unfortunately, I couldn't fly there to see him that day. I also want to mention he is fellow of AICHE, AIMB, Society for Biomaterials, and the Canadian Society of Chemical Engineers, which I forgot. His research leadership on new biomaterials, or re-examining biomaterials, on cell biomaterials interaction, advanced drug delivery methods, but not the way Langer and I are doing it. He is really one step ahead of us. His work has always been how we can create artificial pumps, how we can create systems that are based on sensors and so on, really much more on the medical device. And of course, tissue engineering and regenerative medicine, where of course he has become one of the leaders. I mean, if you ask who are the 3 or 4 major leaders in regenerative medicine, it's Bob Neeram, Mike Sefton, and one more, okay? But at the same, and here are some of the citations. I went yesterday or the day before yesterday and I did a search. His most cited paper is a paper with Maud. Did you know that, Maud? Who is she? I don't know if you knew it. Now you're proud. You have the most cited paper with Mike Sefton on biomaterial-associated thrombosis, and you can see other well-known suspects in there. You can see Dr. Goossens, who, as I understand, Goossens right now, I think he's in Omar, you said? Qatar? Qatar, and he's the Dean of Engineering in Qatar. And of course, Janus. And somewhere here I saw Hassan Ludag from the University of Alberta, and Stevenson, who is a professor at Wichita State, and a few others. And most of that work is classic, I won't say classical, it's biomaterial work of interactions of cells with the biomaterials. Educational contribution, he has been a mentor to many chemical engineers and bioengineers in Canada and throughout the world. Those of us who have followed his travels, we know how close he has been to really many universities. I don't know if you know that in the 80s and 90s he would spend a lot of time at the Université de Paris No with Marcel Josefovich and Jacqueline Josefovich until they retired. They were all the time together, many other associations with Japan and other countries. And a constellation of great graduate students, some of whom you see here today, and many others that you don't see that have really made an impact in the field and have really changed the world that we think in the field. And a few pictures. This is Mike about 11 years ago. He surprised me. He came to my 50th birthday, and I like this picture very much. He looks like he's ready to go sailing. This is a very important picture for me. In 2003, Ed Merrill, At that time, he was 81 years old, received his Founders Award. And here you have 3 of his academic sons. You can recognize the 2. Did you realize that Alan Hoffman was the first PhD student of Ed Merrill in 1957? And this is really a wonderful occasion. And in fact, Alan wanted to be with us, Mike, and he has sent the following message. 60 is nifty, but 70 is heavenly. You are definitely excused from having to wear a tie on your 60th, but we'll expect to see you bright and early next Monday morning, actually Tuesday morning, with your birthday tie on. In any case, Mike, just remember that age is just a number, and you are a number one guy. Happy 60th and many more happy and healthy birthdays, Alan. And this is a little bit closer. 3 friends that went together to school at MIT. Mike and myself, and of course Bob Langer. And we have a lot of memories together. And you heard the letter that was sent earlier by Mike. Congratulations on your 60th, by Bob. Congratulations on your 60th birthday. You're still a youngster, certainly compared to people who are 61 like Nick and myself. While I'm sorry not to be there in person today, I very much look forward to seeing you in Hawaii in December. Mike and Cynthia show up in Maui every 2nd December for a very, very well-known meeting of US-Japan drug delivery. In reality, US-Japan, let's talk and have some nice time in Maui this meeting. As you turn 60, I think of all the wonderful memories we have shared, starting at MIT and Cabot's ice creams, with chocolate cookies in Toronto, Boston brownies, and many non-food experiences as well. Believe me, food is in our #1 in our priorities. I remember the first meeting called the Utah meeting was held in 1991 in Park City, Utah. Since then, 1993, and after that, we've been in Salt Lake City. These were the meetings that Sung Wan Kim and Jim Anderson were organizing, and now a younger generation organizes. So here we are in Park City, Utah. None of us 3 is interested in going for skiing on a Wednesday afternoon, so we are sitting in the hotel. It's a rather second-rate hotel. There is nothing to do. We have gossiped about everything. We have decided who's going to get tenure, who is not, whose research is absolute trash, whose is less trash. These were the days we were not finding anybody's research to be good, but anyhow. And then, ice cream attack. We need some ice cream. And we call room service, and they don't have ice cream. It's 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Finally, I don't remember all the details, but I think we ran, and we found a convenience store, and we got a pint or 2 pints of this, whatever it was, 3rd-rate ice cream. We went back to the hotel, and we started eating this ice cream at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And I can tell you many other stories like this. And this is a nice picture where you have also Tony Mikos, who did his PhD with me and postdoc with Bob Langer, and of course Ali, who did his master's with Mike and then his PhD with Bob, and we have all worked together. This was last year on my 60th birthday down in Houston, in Austin. And this is when Mike got his Founders Award, which is really the highest recognition in the Society for Biomaterials. And here you see him next to John Brash, for those of you who don't know the names. Here's Mike Pensive and John Brash speaking, and David Granger from the University of Utah, and of course Molly. And probably in 40 years that I know him, this was the only time, the first time that I saw him really touched. Mike has never shed a tear, at least not in front of me, but this was the first time that I saw him. He was really touched. It was a marvelous dinner in Amsterdam, a lunch in Amsterdam. It was 2 years ago or something. And he was really touched, and we were all touched that we had him there. We are still trying to achieve. After 38 years, we said physical properties, mechanical stability, chemical inertness, non-toxic materials, non-carcinogenic, non-mutagenic, non-teratogenic, and so on. All this, no. We are still trying to find the solution. And a few years ago, Mike and I published a book called Molecular and Cellular Foundations of Biomaterials. And in that book, he wrote the first chapter, a wonderful chapter, in which basically he talks about the new biomaterial. And he starts by saying, come on, in the 60s and the 70s, everything we were doing is the no. everything was no, and here's the list, non-toxic, and so on. And he says, now we are going into a new generation of materials. And if you read this article, which is really a very small article, or a small introduction, there is something very important here, which closes with the idea biology is important. And in fact, Mike brings the point there. All of us are trying to do chemical modifications of the surface in order to come up with the best biomaterial. He's not quite sure, and he has convinced me. I'm not quite sure that this is really the solution. The solution is much better understanding of biology, much better understanding of immune response. And then that would be really the solution. It has been an incredible journey of 38 years. For me personally, Mike has been not only the friend that took me when I arrived, and he was younger by 1 year when I arrived at MIT, and showed me the world, but as I have said many times in public, he has been also my biological nemesis, because I always like to look at things mathematically and from a chemistry point of view. And he would take me aside and say, okay, you said what you said in public, learn your biology now, okay? And he would bring me back always. It's really a great pleasure. I didn't tell you anything about my research. I know I was not going to be able to share all of these things with you. But I thank you for listening. I thank you for being here. Michael, happy birthday on Tuesday. Ladies and gentlemen, may I present to you Michael Sefton.
Sure.
Loaded on there.
Oh, okay.
I'll sit beside you.
Professor Pappas, you didn't mention the great contributions that Professor Sefton made in leadership in such areas as being on the grant selection committee of the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council and taking leadership there, and then on a higher level committee which sought to enhance the stature of chemical engineering within the whole grant selection of all of science in Canada. And then internally in the department, he was acting chair for a time and made some pretty tough decisions, and was the president of Chemical Engineering Research Consultants. And these enhanced all of us in the Chemical Engineering department in a big way too.
Thank you.
Maybe I should go a little bit.
So I wasn't planning on showing any data slides or any PowerPoint slides, which had the bulleted list anyway, but I did have some things I want to show. So first of all, I want to say I am delighted that everybody's here. I am delighted that Molly and Melitza and Allison and Ali organized this event, all stimulated in the background by my friend Nicholas, who felt it was very important that we have a 60th birthday party for me. I am delighted to have any party and any time when you're a guest of honor, but I have to admit I am highly embarrassed by it all, and I apologize to Molly sorry, because this is the third one of these things that she's organized on my behalf, and it's sort of like enough is enough. On these other occasions, a number of jokes I can tell here. On these other occasions, I sort of made comments and I repeat them again because I think they're appropriate and they're tiresome for some of you, then too bad. First of all, these events like this remind me of the adage, be good to people on their way up so they'll be good to you on your way down. Also reminds me that the kind of things I do is I'm in the opportunities business, and so the most important thing I do is provide opportunities for either students to do a PhD or undergraduate students to learn something about biology, or colleagues to develop their own expertise or to build institutes and departments and developments and companies, all of which I think is kind of my primary job description, is kind of creating, enabling, allowing people to kind of capture these opportunities when they come about. The third one is actually a new one that I clued into, or was triggered by something that I read recently. So in the Bible the first 5 chapters of the Bible talk about Moses' teachings. And it's interesting, the word they use for teachings, the Hebrew word is lakachti, which means actually takings. And the interpretation is that the student takes from the teacher. Like taking a course from a professor. And I actually, if you look at the Hebrew, it's actually really saying that Moses is taking, that the teacher is taking. And I think from all of those who are my students, whether graduate students or undergraduate students, I've taken more from you than I think that you've taken from me. And so I want to thank you all for teaching me immunology, or teaching me cell biology, or teaching me about video capture, all sorts of other things which I knew nothing about then, and probably still.
No. Sorry, Once Upon a Time.
It would be Once Upon a Time.
It's not Sefton. No, it's Once Upon a Time.
Right there. All right, let me do it so you don't mess it up.
That's tough love.
All right. So that was my introduction, and that's perfectly. So Once Upon a Time. I'm just going here to do this. So once upon a time, there was a young professor, 24 years old, starting in the Department of Chemical Engineering, entering the Wahlberg building, looking not much different than the students did. And I remember one of my first memories was, in fact, not being allowed to use the photocopy machine, because the photocopy machine was reserved for professors and not allowed for students. Once upon a time, there were 3 people who went to MIT, one from Athens, one from Albany, New York, and one from Toronto, to become educated in chemical engineering, and we did find each other, maybe not so much in the lab, but in our other activities. It's hard to find a painting of ping pong, but or going to Cabot's ice cream, but we certainly spend a lot of time there. I can start the story earlier and actually talk about a blind date I went on to. My friends liked the girl, and I had access to a car, and so I had to invite a friend, and we had a very nice date at the exhibition, and a few years later we had a family. This is our typical family portrait for us, and I'm glad that my son was able to join us today. And of course, one of the responsibilities of the family is both to be proud of you, but also to remind you to keep you humble. And of course, I'm still required to take out the kitty litter, regardless of what awards and symposia you organize on my behalf. maybe what you want to do is hear a little bit more about the work, although that you've already heard about it in some respects or other, but I will give you a different interpretation of it and have maybe a different outcome. So one of the things we do in the lab is grow fat. Mark Butler in particular is focused on this, and some of the other students are also exploiting this method. And we're trying to really do regeneration. Regeneration of the liver would be one ideal, but certainly regenerative medicine is a large part of what we try to do. We try to do that because the population is aging, the community is getting larger, there's getting many more old people, and maybe more importantly, fewer young people, and so there's issues about how do we keep healthcare costs down, and we need to sort of, while that community is getting older, provide the appropriate approaches for them. And that's regenerative medicine and tissue engineering. So as Allison pointed out, we came to an approach of modular tissue engineering, really with an idea from classical chemical engineering, building a packed distillation column where one creates scalable units by taking small units and adding many hundreds of little pieces of packing to make a distillation column, small one or a big one. And this particular image, which I have a better version of it, the ones in the photocopy, of George Whiteside, and I sort of saw these little pieces and recognized that, gee, this would be an interesting way to kind of create larger structures by taking modules and allowing them to self-assemble. And from that idea, as you see for both Ali and Allison, has grown up into a kind of an approach for doing tissue engineering. Our approach, the primary focus was that to primary vascularized structures, which we could rebuild the blood vessels within tissue engineering constructs, blood vessels that were not present in normal tissue engineered structures, and with a view to trying to treat diabetes and to kind of transplant islets, which is what Rohini has just been trying to do, and had some successes, but set up a platform for the next students who are willing to think about more solutions, or to grow hearts using cardiomyocytes and endothelial cells and try to make a tissue engineered constructs by modular components. We don't use cow dung in our modular components, but maybe it would work better than collagen. What we're trying to do is recapitulate vascular structures is the fundamental problem. And using endothelial cells and modules and understanding that vascularization is really the central problem that we're focused on. We do that not so much in vitro, and as somebody else mentioned, sort of I kind of emphasize the in vivo work, and so we're very much important in using animal models. We don't use horses as models, although I know one of my colleagues does, Professor Davies does use horses in his studies, but we tend to use mice. They are, and rats are easier to manipulate and to work with. The problem with doing work in vivo is that things get to be a bit of a mess. And so it's very hard to interpret what you're getting. It's not as nice and neat as in an in vitro study. We worry about self and non-self and the immunological reactions that take place as we have different species and even different, in an allograft model of different individuals. We have to manipulate that with appropriate drugs, so using Lipitor or Prograf to manipulate the immune response, but we still frankly face a lot of cell death, and our problem is trying to balance out that cell death with a kind of positive response of vascularity. But one of the things to learn is that sort of everything you look at, it really depends on how you look at it. When we started with Allison, it was all a matter of trying to generate vascular supply, having nice non-thrombogenic endothelial cells lining on the modules, having them assemble so we can get blood flow. But as the students did work in vivo, they realized there's a whole different approach, and that the endothelial cells were coming off the modules and generating a vascular response using the host endothelial cells. And so it was very much how you look at the image, some people might see the Venus de Milo, others would see the hallucinogenic toreador in the background. So depending on how you look at things. In a different approach, and Mike May has already mentioned this, we've also been interested in kind of creating new materials that might that are angiogenic. We really discovered those materials and thought, really in the early days, Mike failed to mention that we're interested in delivering these to the heart to see if we can get blood vessels to regrow in the heart. We spun off a company, Ramon Therapeutics, and I thought Mike was going to tell the story about how Ari came up with a name for Ramon, which is Hebrew for pomegranate, and these are pomegranate trees. The pomegranate is an ancient symbol, a medieval symbol for life. And that was sort of one of our visions for Ramon Therapeutics. And so that took us to having an interest in skin. But also we've changed focus a little bit more and more now about the enzymes, the matrix metalloproteins that are destroying the skin tissue as it's being laid down, and trying to inhibit that skin tissue. What's even a more general sense, and I'd like to thank Ali for this picture who's sort of pointing it out to me, what we're really interested in, whether it's for modular tissue engineering or in the case of the repair of chronic skin wounds, is the remodeling that goes on from what we implant to what we end up with. We know what we start with, but very much what we end up with is very different, and all of this is really fundamental to what we call the regeneration process. And I would posit for the next 10 years, that central question for tissue engineers is going to be remodeling and the connecting between what we built in the lab and what happens in vivo. So I've been struggling this week, and some of you, I have to apologize to some of the students who have come in to see me. I've been quite grumpy all week because it's getting to be Friday, and my talk is not ready. It's barely even finished yet. I've had other meetings, dealing with Ramon, other meetings talking with another company we're trying to start up. And so it's all been very difficult to figure out how I'm going to end this talk. The beginning was great, the middle I could manage through, but then I really wasn't sure how I was going to end this thing. And so in the words of Monty Reichert, I learned this at a Gordon conference, so the question was, how does Jackson Pollock know when one more splash from the paint is too many? How does he know when to stop? And with that, I didn't know when to stop. So I said, once upon a time was how I started. So maybe I should say they all lived happily ever after. Or maybe I should be more mysterious and try to take a line out of from Humphrey Bogart. I think this is the start of a beautiful friendship. Or I should really just try to figure out what it was I was trying to say here and tell my story. And so as the students probably know that some of my mantra, whether it's what's the hypothesis, it really actually comes down to what's the story you're trying to say here? What are we trying to say? What are the slides we should be using? What's the point of what we're doing? And so the story of the lecture is what's the story? And the story can be something that we're familiar with. It can be only a fragment of a story, where we've only been able to focus in on one part of the piece. What's the purpose of the story? The story is to exchange information. It's a convenient way to think about things and to talk about them. It's a way to understand things, particularly to understand very complex matters. It allows us to pull things together. Sometimes the stories are clear. Sometimes the stories get twisted around. But that actually becomes very much part of it. It's that twisted around story that provides us with new insight. Sometimes the stories are familiar. the sheriff who walks into town and clears up all the bad guys. And that's a very nice story. It has a nice beginning, middle, and end. It's like immobilizing RGB peptides. But the real stories are the stories where the sheriff goes into town and loses. Or the sheriff, and the classic one is, the one-armed sheriff. So it's really the unexpected part of that story. And it's that unexpected part of the story that says, wait a second, there's something else going on in here I don't understand. It's the modular tissue engineering, which instead of forming nice blood vessels, actually stimulates another remodeling process. That's the unexpected. That's the piece that is most interesting. But of course, the story is really awesome, unfinished. And certainly, I want to make a point, my story is unfinished. And often these events, I remember going to one some years ago, I think it was Ed Merrill's 70th birthday party, and one had the distinct impression that the department was throwing that event for him to help them out the door. And so I want to tell you right now that I am not going anywhere. There are many more worlds to discover and new fields to go, and despite sort of jokes I sometimes make that I may not be here then, one's going to have to drag me out kicking and screaming because of this very lovely event you have, and I will end with this Accenture ad. And thank you very much.
So that was a great talk. We didn't arrange this to kick you out, just so you know. There was no message there. So on behalf of the organising committee, we got this was the surprise part, to just say thank you for your leadership and mentorship and humour over the years. So,
Thank you.
While you open your gift.
Okay.
yeah.
Oh, open the gift first.
Well, maybe.
I think
What-
it's
is it, a rocket?
okay. I think you can be careful. Just be careful.
You wanna, well, you wanna explain the gift?
Do we need life insurance here?
No, we do not need life insurance. Of course, we're really nervous what's inside. Molly will help.
Did Lisa have a hand in this, Nicholas?
No, you'll be surprised. It's completely unexpected.
Well, it was totally unexpected.
I'm just kind of worried watching Molly stand back. And
No, I just don't want to.
I think it's the other way around. The way
Yeah,
it's
that's right. Pomegranates.
Because we didn't know what we wanted.
Oh, very nice. So let me show it. It's 613 Seeds of Wisdom and Visionary Leadership dedicated to Michael from colleagues and friends on the occasion of his 60th